Hello and welcome. I am Tamara and today we are going to be making this adorable small tote. I like to use this for my craft supplies, so I'm going to be calling this my craft tote, but you can really use it for lots of different things. The nice thing about this tote though is that it has pockets on the inside, very simple pockets, no zippers. So if you're afraid of zippers, this does not have zippers. And it has enough pockets. It's got two larger pockets that are perfect for things like your notepads. It's got a medium-sized pocket, which is perfect for like a rotary cutter. And then it has one singular small pocket that's perfect for a small, slim pair of scissors or a nice pen. And I did want to mention that I did spend the time to come up with a printable version for this tutorial. So yes, in this sewing tutorial that is in this video here, everything that you need to know will be listed in this tutorial. So you don't need the printed pattern. However, I did create a printed pattern. And the reason why I did that is because sometimes it's nice to actually look at a piece of paper while you're sewing your project and double check your measurements and all of that. So everything that you need to know is listed in this printable pattern, which is linked in the description down below. So why don't we jump on in and get sewing?
Cut 2 pieces of your woven fusible interfacing at 12.5 inches high by 16.5 inches wide. Then cut 2 pieces out of your fusible fleece and cut that 13 inches high by 16.5 inches wide. Then, moving on to your lining fabric, you will cut that, again, 2 pieces at 12.5 inches high by 16.5 inches wide. Then you will have what I'm going to refer to as fabric B, because that is how I refer to it in my sewing pattern. And fabric B is the bottom piece of the outer tote, as well as the inside pockets. So you will cut 2 pieces of fabric 12 inches high by 16.5 inches wide, and then another 7.5 inches high by 16.5 inches wide. Then from fabric A, which is the top pieces of the outer panels of the tote, you will cut 2 of those 6.5 inches high by 16.5 inches wide. You will also need webbing. You will need 2 strips cut at 18 inches long. So for step 1, we will be making the outer panels, and you will be making 2 outer panels. So take both of your fabrics that you cut from fabric A, and then take both of the smaller cuts that you cut from fabric B, and then take one from each and lay them along their long edge, right sides together. You'll pin along that edge, and then you will sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance along that edge, and you'll do that for both pieces of fabric so that you are creating 2 panels at a time. Then, once you've sewn those 2 together, you can take it to your iron and just press open that seam. Then it's time to grab the fusible fleece that you cut, and we are going to be attaching it to the back of these panels that we just created. Make sure that the rough side of the fusible fleece, that will be the side where the glue is laying face down onto the back side of your panel. Then attach it using your fusible fleece instructions. However, I am going to say that if your instructions suggest that you add like a wet cloth on top of it, I have tried that method. I don't find it works that great for me. So the method that I tend to do is making sure that my fusible fleece is underneath my fabric, and then I just press from my fabric side down, and I find that it melts the glue well enough for me. But of course, I don't want to risk it for you, so if you are more comfortable and you've never used fusible fleece before, follow your fusible fleece instructions. Once your fusible fleece is attached to the back of your panel, then take it back to your sewing machine and sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance along the top of the center seam and the bottom of the center seam. Do that using a top stitch. For myself, I like my top stitch to be a 3mm length. My regular stitch length is a 2.5mm length. Once you've done that for both of your panels, then it is time to cut away a 2.5-inch square from the bottom corners of both of the panels. So both the bottom left and the bottom right corners, you will cut 2.5-inch squares away. And then along the top edge of this panel, just do a marking of 4.5 inches in from the outer edge in on both the left and the right sides. That marking you will use later for your webbing, just so that you know exactly where you're going to attach it. Then step 2 is preparing our pockets. So take the fabric that you still have left from fabric B. So those are your 2 larger pieces of fabric that you cut. Fold them right sides together along the long edge, so the 16.5-inch width. Then you will pin it and you will sew a 1/2-inch seam allowance along that long edge. Then press that seam open. Then reach on in and turn your tube right side out. And now you want to press this pocket flat. Now the previous press may have seemed a bit silly along that seam allowance, but I find if I press it before I turn the tube right side out, then this next step is just a little bit easier to find that seam. And I just roll it with my fingers so that the top of that seam is the top of my pocket, and then just press the tube flat. Then you're going to sew a top stitch along that top edge. So you will be sealing in that seam allowance. Now it's time to mark our pockets. So you will mark 4 inches in from the left as well as 4 inches in from the right. And then one of these panels you will also mark 2.5 inches in from the right edge. I do this because it creates a nice little pocket for a pen. If you don't think you're going to need a small pocket for something like a pen, then you can probably skip that extra mark. And now it's time for step 3, where we will be making the lining panels. So grab your woven fusible interfacing pieces as well as your lining pieces, and once again, following the instructions, attach that interfacing to the back of your lining fabric, however the instructions tell you to do so. Then it will be time to cut 2.5-inch squares from both the left and the right side of your lining, of course the bottom side. And then along the top, you want to make a 4.5-inch mark in from the left, a 4.5-inch mark in from the right, but we are not quite done adding marked lines just yet. From the top edge of that 2.5-inch corner that we cut away, you are going to measure 3.25 inches up from there and draw a line across the entire project. This is going to allow us to do the next step, which is to grab your pocket pieces and lay them across that marked line and pin them in place. Now the top of your pocket will have that top stitch that you've already created. The bottom of your pocket has no stitching yet. So pin it in place that way. Sew a top stitch along the bottom edge of your pocket and then along all of the previously marked lines that we had created earlier.
All right, so our panels have been pieced and now it is time to actually put our tote bag together. But before we do that, I did want to ask, if you are enjoying this tutorial, please hit that thumbs up button. That allows YouTube to know that this is a good tutorial to share with others. And if you don't want to lose me on YouTube, then please hit the subscribe button. All right, let's carry on and continue making our small tote bag.
We are now going to be piecing these inner panels together. So take both inner panels and lay them right sides together, and then pin along both the left and the right edges, as well as the bottom edge. You are going to be sewing a 1/2-inch seam allowance along both side seams, but along the bottom edge, you are only going to sew a line 2 inches in along both sides. You want to leave a nice open space there in the middle of that lining because you will be turning your project right side out later on using that opening. Then take it back from your sewing machine, and now we are going to press open our seam allowances. Step 5 is very similar. We are going to be piecing the outer panels together. Now, the big difference here is that you are going to be sewing a 1/2 inch seam allowance along both sides as well as along the entire bottom. So just lay those panels right sides together, pin along the edges and the bottom, and then sew those 1/2 inch seam allowances in place. And then you can take it back to your iron and press open those seam allowances as well. Just make sure that your iron isn't actually hitting the fleece itself unless you have your iron set to low so that it doesn't end up melting that fleece. So step 6 is where we will actually box the bottom corners of the lining and the outer shell. So I'm going to start with the outer shell here, and I'm just going to line up my side seam with my bottom seam and then pinch that in place. Then just throw a few clips along that bottom edge, and I do like to throw one on either side as well. I just find it helps me when I'm at my sewing machine to make sure that everything is nice and flat. And you will do this for both corners. Take it to your sewing machine and sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance along both of those boxed corners. And once you're done boxing the corners of the outer shell, you will do the same thing with the lining as well. Then, once everything is sewn as far as those boxed corners go, just grab a pair of scissors and trim about a 1/4 inch of that fabric away from all of those edges. This will just reduce bulk once you've turned your project right side out. All right, so in step 7, we are going to be adding our handles. So grab your 18-inch long webbing pieces and grab the lining. Turn the lining right side out so that you can see your 4.5-inch markings that you added earlier. And then you will lay the webbing so that it loops from one of those 4.5-inch marks down and around to the other 4.5-inch mark. So it's going to line up so that the marked line is along the outside edge of your webbing. Make sure your webbing is not twisted, and then measure 1 inch up from the top of the lining's edge and make your webbing poke out 1 inch. The reason for that is later we're going to be doing extra seams, and it will give that handle a little bit more extra strength. Then turn your lining over and add the second piece of webbing in the exact same way. Once everything has been pinned in place, then we're going to move on to step 8. Here you will take your lining and you will tuck it inside the outer shell. So your fabric will be laying right sides together. So the right side of the lining is facing the right side of the outer shell. Then line up your side seams and clip that in place. And then from there, just clip around the entire outer edge. Of course, making sure that your handles are not shifting around too much. That's why we do have those 4.5-inch mark lines on the outer fabric as well. So if you want, you can line up those marked lines and then pin your handles in place accordingly. And then it's just a matter of going all the way around and adding more and more pins until you are happy with how it is positioned. Then you will take this to your sewing machine and you will sew a 1/2-inch seam allowance around that entire top edge. Now, this will be easier to do if you remove that free arm section off of your sewing machine. That's part of your sewing bed. Most sewing machines have that piece that you can just slide off, and that will just make it a little bit easier. And step 9, it's starting to get pretty exciting. We are starting to see our tote bag come together. So reach on into your lining and reach through the opening that we left there and pull the entire project right side out. Then gently push out all of the boxed corners with your finger. And now it's time to seal the lining shut. So just lay the opening flat, pin along that bottom edge. it should be fairly easy to line up since you pressed this seam earlier. Clip along that edge and then sew a narrow seam allowance, just sealing the lining shut. Moving on to step 10, you will tuck the lining into the tote bag itself, and it is officially looking like a tote bag, but we need to add a few more seam allowances to finish this up nicely. So you can take this to your iron and press along that entire top edge to make sure that all of your fabric is exactly where you want it to be, or you could finger press it if you wanted, and then clip around the entire top edge so all of the fabric is lined up in a very neat and tidy way, so the lining is not rolling up past the outer fabric. Then take it back to your sewing machine and you will sew 2 top stitches. You will sew a 1/4 of an inch top stitch and you will sew a 1/2 inch top stitch around that entire top edge. By doing this, you are giving your handles a little bit of that extra security that I was telling you about earlier. And I also highly recommend that you start and stop along a side point so that your little back stitch notches aren't on the front of your tote, but are on more of the side edge. So they're just a little less visible. And once again, this will be easier to do if you are able to remove that sewing arm from your sewing machine.
And that, my friends, is how you can make a small tote bag. Please let me know in the comments down below what you plan on using your tote bag for, or perhaps you're going to give it away as a Christmas gift. And don't forget, I do have the printed version linked in the description down below. I probably won't have any more videos coming out before this Christmas, so I hope that you guys have a very Merry Christmas and a wonderful New Year. I will see you next time. Bye for now.